Does Russell's teapot prove Christian gullibility? Well, maybe, maybe not, but this video certainly does. This is everything wrong with the way that Christians look at the world, and by extension, just about every religion out there, since by and large they're all doing just about the same thing. So here we go again, down the deep dark rabbit hole of religious insanity. When will it ever end? Today, we're going to start on a series of sorts taken from a single video. This video was done by Rationality Rules, at least in part, and while his video was excellent, I'll link to it in the comments, and I recommend you go take a look at it, but there was a lot more to say on the subject, and a lot that he left out that I really wanted to address. I honestly have no idea how many videos this is going to be at the moment. I'm thinking 3, but I could be completely wrong. It's going to be at least a couple. But there is so much wrong here that I think it's necessary to really break this down. So let's go talk about Russell's teapot and how absurdly gullible these people really are. Plus, we're going to do a deep dive into why Christian evidence isn't actually evidence at all, and that's going to take a while. So, strap in and let's get to it.
Over the last couple of weeks, I decided to carve out some time and talk about the burden of proof.
Good. Great subject, one that really isn't talked about nearly enough. The problem, of course, is that most of the time, the religious don't actually understand what the burden of proof is. They can't meet it when it comes to their religious beliefs, so it's off to the end zone so they can retrieve the goalposts and go for a marathon run. We're going to start off with the definition of the burden of proof. Anyone who makes a positive claim that X is true or X is false, anything like that, they have the burden of proof to show that their claim is actually correct. People who do not make a positive claim, people who say, I don't believe you, they do not have a burden of proof to show that their claim is actually true. That's why if you say, I have a dragon in my garage, and I say, I don't believe you, I haven't gained a burden of proof to prove you wrong because I haven't said that you don't. I've only said, I don't believe that you do. Nothing that you've said has convinced me that you're right. Now, keep this in mind moving forward, because he's going to completely ignore this point.
What is it? And more importantly, in debates and regular conversations, do non-Christians or Christians shoulder the burden of proof? The first video caused some consternation amongst some in the atheist community, and so I answered some of their comments in last week's video.
Sorry, didn't see it. Didn't even know your channel existed until now. Therefore, we're not going to address any of that. I might go back and look at that video at some point if my audience wants me to, but at the moment, we're going with what we've got here. The question that we have on the table is whether non-Christians or Christians have the burden of proof. Now, I can't speak for specific instances, but in any case where I am personally involved, it is only the Christian making positive claims. Therefore, only the Christian needs to back it up. I never, ever say your God doesn't exist or that you're absolutely wrong. I will only say, from the best evidence that I've ever seen, I'm not convinced. And I'm very careful to say it that way. I am very careful not to say there are no gods, because we don't know that. I only say that there is no evidence which supports the actual existence of gods. And that part is painfully easy to demonstrate. Now, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be some hiding in a hole in the ground somewhere, but no one should believe a thing is true until there is evidence that that thing is actually true. And in this instance, We just don't have that evidence, at least not that I've personally seen. But anyway, let's let this guy continue.
But walking down this path, so to speak, and seeing some of the responses, particularly by those who disagree with me, it just brought back this distant memory of something that I was wrestling with maybe 10 years ago now, maybe more than that. It was called Russell's Teapot. Russell's Teapot is named after the famous atheist Bertrand Russell, who, by the way, Bertrand Russell was a massive intellectual for his time.
Now, this is the spot where Rationality Rules really went to town on the background on Russell's Teapot and how Nate here gets pretty much all of it wrong. Therefore, I'm just going to do a lot of fast forwarding in this section because I don't want to have to do all that again. And if you want to see it in context, of course, the link to the original video is in the description below. If you want to see how all of this comes together, go watch Rationality Rules' video because I think you'll enjoy it. Therefore, let's just check in with the chipmunks.
I strongly admire Russell's contributions. His writings, in particular, he was a very smart man. But he came up with this challenge to Christianity that centered on the thought experiment. Imagine a teapot floating in outer space. What does this have to do with the burden of proof or Christianity at all? I'm going to talk about it in this video. Now stay tuned to the end of the video for an important announcement related to the future of Wise Disciple. Right, now let's jump in. As I mentioned very often when discussing the existence of God with atheists, agnostics, skeptics, even some Christians, the notions of the burden of proof and supporting evidence are raised. Sometimes atheists and skeptics will say that they don't shoulder the burden of proof because they're not the ones making claims.
Just jumping in here, but that is absolutely correct. Of course, it depends on the individual involved. Anyone making a positive claim does have a burden of proof for that claim, and whether they are an atheist or a skeptic or not, that is the case. I get the sense from a lot of theists, at least in these kinds of cases, that they think that there are separate and distinct rules for the religious and different rules for the non-religious, and that is absolutely not the case. We only need one set of standards, and everyone follows it. It's really not that hard to understand.
Now, this is important to talk about, as good evidence provides a foundation for a reasonable inference on this issue.
I agree, good evidence is essential on virtually every issue. The problem we have comes when one side doesn't understand what good evidence is, and we see that consistently with the religious. We're going to see it again here today, I'm sure, which is why I want to spend some time talking about evidence and about critical thinking, and why the religious are so often not engaging in it at all. But I'll let him get into it, and we'll start pointing out where he goes wrong.
As well as just talking about this idea that those who make claims must support them with some kind of evidence. So for example, if God exists, then there should be some evidence to support claims of his existence. And as Christian case makers continue to show, there are a number of evidences that support the existence of God.
Nope, you're wrong, and demonstrably so. Because here's a little secret you might not know. First off, evidences isn't a word. It's evidence. It's not evidences. You know you're talking to someone ignorant on the subject matter if you hear them using that word. Secondly, though, evidence isn't because I like it. It isn't, well, it sounds good to me, so it has to be true. Your feelings don't matter. That's why I try to specify objective evidence, things that can be reasonably shown to exist in the real world and be demonstrably true, and that logically point directly to the conclusion actually being the case. Remember that last one, because it's really where the religious go completely wrong. Unfortunately, what we see far too often are the religious saying, well, it's got to be evidence because it fits into my worldview. Yeah, that is not going to work, sorry, because your worldview doesn't actually mean anything. Your worldview is just an overlay that you're placing over reality to protect your precious widow fifis. And that's not how reality operates. So you have to have something that anybody can look at, anyone can examine, without having to have any kind of beliefs on it first, and it must point to the facts.
Unfortunately, some atheists believe that there can be no evidence for God whatsoever, and it is from this mistaken presupposition that a particular strategy involving a teapot floating in outer space has emerged.
But that's wrong. There is a difference between can be no evidence and is no evidence. If there was a God, and this goes for any God, not just the Christian version, then there should be evidence that said God is actually there. It should be easily found, easily tested, and easily shown to point directly to an existing deity. The problem is, there isn't any of that. If there was, the religious would be out there carrying it through the streets on their shoulders blowing trumpets. But they're not because it doesn't exist. That's why they turn to philosophical arguments, which we'll get to in a moment, I'm sure. But the fact that this evidence isn't being reported on by every news agency on the planet tells us something about the quality of their evidence. Because they don't actually have evidence. They only have claims.
So the argument goes, we cannot conclusively prove that there is not a teapot orbiting the sun somewhere in outer space. But, given the lack of evidence for such a teapot, its likelihood is so low that the reasonable conclusion should be that it does not exist.
Now, this is getting back into Rationality Rules territory, so we're going to fast forward a bit after this. But he's simply misunderstanding what Bertrand Russell was saying, as if that's really any surprise. Ultimately, this is an example of what Christians are doing wrong, one of the many, many, many things that they're doing wrong. They are making claims without any evidentiary support. In fact, often they are saying that evidentiary support is outright impossible to have, but they're right anyway. Russell even went so far as to say that the teapot couldn't be detected through any means possible at the time that he wrote it in the early 1950s, just like the Christians do today. It is shifting the burden of proof to say that something is true unless someone else can prove it wrong. That's not how it works. You make the claim, you prove it right, that's how it works. And that's what the religious do all the time. They're shifting this sucker all over the place. The burden of proof demands that it isn't our job to prove you wrong, it's your job to prove yourself right, and they can never, ever, ever do that through, as I specify, objective evidence. And objective is important. Objective means it is not subject to your wishes and your dreams and your feelings and your emotions and your interpretations. It is something that is right there for everyone to see. And they can't do that, and they don't even try. So it's clear he doesn't get it. In fact, it's pretty hard to imagine not getting it any worse than he is. But we do have other things to cover, so let's jump forward a little bit.
Likewise, we cannot conclusively prove that God does not exist, but given the lack of evidence for God, the reasonable conclusion should be that he does not exist. This particular argument originated with philosopher Russell, a letter that he wrote in 1958, and here's part of that letter. I do not think the existence of the Christian God any more probable than the existence of the gods of Olympus or Valhalla. To take another illustration, nobody can prove that there is not between the Earth and Mars a China teapot revolving in an elliptical orbit, but nobody thinks it's sufficiently likely to be taken into account in practice. I think the Christian God just as unlikely. As one of Russell said, a number of decades later, Richard Dawkins commented on Russell's idea in The God Delusion. This is what he said. Russell's point is that the burden of proof rests with the believers, not the non-believers. Mine is the related point that the odds in favor of the teapot, or spaghetti monster, or Esmeralda Keith unicorn, whatever, are not equal to the odds against. So there are a couple of problems that I just want to talk about in the rest of this video with elements in Russell's and Dawkins' comments, all right? First, they both assume that there is no evidence for God.
And this would be the perfect place to present them if they actually existed. And that's the thing. You will find the religious pulling this one all the time. Well, we have evidence. Great. Where is it? Oh, then they'll make a bunch of excuses for why they can't actually present it, but they never actually present the actual objective evidence that they think that they have. Because we constantly ask them for their evidence, and they can never actually come up with any. Instead, they just come up with more claims, more faith, more nonsense that doesn't prove anything, and they act like they don't really understand the problem. Mostly, I think, because they don't. They have no clue what evidence really is. It isn't just anything that makes you feel good. It isn't anything that gets you where you want to go. It's something that points directly to the truth of the claim that you're making in a way that anyone can use that evidence to get to that conclusion without having to hold a belief in it first. It's not confirmation bias, which is what the religious are usually doing. It is a demonstration that the claim is actually true in the real world. And they have absolutely none of that.
At least it seems that Russell's presupposition is that there is no evidence, thus allowing for his analogy. And Dawkins appears to accept Russell's analogy wholesale. Second, Dawkins claims through Russell that since there is no evidence for God, theists are the only ones that bear the burden of proof.
Again, if you have evidence, where is it? The only rational conclusion that we can come to is if you haven't presented it, and they haven't, then it's unlikely to actually exist. Or, at the very least, no one has any access to it, and we can only make decisions based on what we currently have available. The fact that you people are taking your wishes and your dreams and your blind faith and trying to call that evidence, that doesn't make it evidence. We're looking for real evidence, objective evidence, and you still haven't come up with any. Maybe you ought to get on that.
Now, like I said, I've talked about the burden of proof and shouldering the burden of proof in a couple of previous videos that I highly encourage you go check out if you have not already watched those videos. But here's my problem with Russell's presupposition. When an atheist states that there is no evidence for a teapot floating in outer space, he likely means that there is no empirical evidence for it.
Because in any case regarding things that supposedly exist in the real world, that's what's required. If you want to prove that Bigfoot exists, for example, you need to come with a body or some hair or genetic material, something like that, that shows that the real thing called Bigfoot actually exists. Anything that either exists in or interacts with the physical universe, and that is something that your God supposedly does, it requires empirical evidence to back it up. And supposedly, according to you people, that's what your God is. Because if that's not what your God is, then what the hell difference does it make? Meet the standards that exist. Don't make up your own. We'll wait.
In other words, to say that there is no evidence is to say that, as far as we know, no one has seen or touched a teapot floating in outer space. But to suggest that evidence for God is the same thing as empirical evidence for a teapot is to misunderstand the evidence for God typically appealed to by theists.
Which isn't our fault, it's yours. Because what you're appealing to isn't evidence, it's fantasy. It's faith masquerading as fact. You have to meet the standards that exist, and if you can't, we aren't obligated to take you seriously. The failure here is yours, not ours. This is more sprinting around with the goalposts. They're where they are for a reason, because they work. But you can't work with them, and that's why you have to keep playing the victim and playing make-believe that somehow everybody else is doing you dirty because you can't reach where the rational standards already are. And that's sounding distinctly like a you problem, right?
Related to this issue, Dr. Brian Garvey writes this: God is invoked as an explanation for why the universe exists at all, why it is intelligible, why it is governed by laws, why it is governed by the laws it is rather than some other laws, and doubtless many other things.
And this is the screen that I saw that convinced me I had to do this video. Everything that's said here is just wrong. Yes, God is invoked, not observed, not tested, not demonstrated, as an explanation for a whole bunch of stuff that you can't actually show was caused by or affected by any real objectively verifiable God. Those are all just claims. You could erase the word God and just insert anything you wanted. The flying spaghetti monster, invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies, flatulent leprechauns, you name it, it doesn't really matter. You could just put anything you wanted to in there, and it doesn't change the validity of the statement at all, because the statement has no validity whatsoever. Because when we're asking for evidence, we're not asking what you can invoke, what you can believe, what you have faith in. We're asking what you can prove. Prove it. That's what the evidence does. Unless you can do more than invoke an emotionally comforting claim, you have absolutely nothing. You have to do a whole lot better than this.
So therefore, the evidences for God are the universe. It is the intelligibility of the universe, its physical laws, etc.
Except you haven't proven any of that. This is just, look at the trees, which is stupid. You can't point to a tree and say, this proves God, because it doesn't. It only proves the tree, because there it is. There's the evidence for the tree. You haven't gotten to the evidence for any God yet. You have to do a whole lot better. You'd have to show that an actual, real, existing God somehow made that tree through some demonstrable means that we can examine. Got any of that? Of course you don't. What you believe doesn't matter. What it says in a book of mythology doesn't matter. It's only what you can objectively demonstrate in the real world utilizing verifiable evidence that does. Because again, we can just insert anything that we want in place of God, and it doesn't change anything. You don't get to create a special category for your imaginary friend because you can't meet the rational standards that exist. This is what the religious try to do. And this is why they fail.
So Russell's analogy fails in large part because it likens two different sets of evidences. Evidences for some kind of floating object out in space, and evidences that are effects of an explanation.
A made-up explanation. Now, you might really like that explanation, but that doesn't get you to the truth, only to your own emotionally comforting fantasy. If there really is a teapot out there somewhere floating around in space, then you have to have evidence to support it. Not your wishes, not your dreams, evidence. If there really is a God out there someplace, you have to have evidence to support it. You don't get special dispensation to pretend otherwise just because you are unable to meet the standards that exist. Yet that's exactly what they're trying to do. They have arbitrarily defined their God in such a way where it can't be supported with evidence just because they know they don't have any evidence. But if you don't have any evidence, how do you know that your God is real? How did you make this discovery? And most importantly, how did you test it? Because that's the point that they always go sideways, because they can't test it. They just have to believe it. They're just pretending that they're being put upon by people who are telling them that it just doesn't work that way. Because it doesn't. Meet the standards or stop trying. Nobody is going to take you seriously just because you whine.
Russell's teapot is not an explanation for anything. It simply exists as a rhetorical device. God, on the other hand, is an explanation for a number of things.
No, it's a placeholder for your own ignorance. You want it to be there. It makes you feel good to believe that it's there. Whether or not it's actually there, it's really irrelevant to the religious. But we're not interested in your fee-fees. We care if the thing that you claim exists actually exists. And we have only one method for demonstrating that anything is real in the reality that we all share. Unfortunately for you, your claimed explanation can't meet the standard that has been set up and objectively verified to work, and you're too emotionally attached to it to give it up. So You're just sitting there making fools of yourselves, trying to pretend that you and your magical man in the sky are somehow special and don't have to come up to critical muster. And unfortunately for you, you're just wrong, and you're making yourself look like an idiot.
Now, I'll get to why this matters with the burden of proof, so stick with me on this. But with regard to the universe itself, consider the Kalam cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause.
And nowhere in that is God even mentioned. Because, again, God is just a placeholder for their own ignorance. You can't just fill in God as an explanation for anything that you don't understand. There are all kinds of things that we don't understand, at least not yet, and we might never understand them. Just because that makes you uncomfortable, that doesn't mean that you get to make up an amazing answer that you just yanked straight out of your asshole. That's the point. We're trying to show how you're doing everything rationally wrong, but this isn't rational. It's all about your feelings and your childish emotional state. You just want it to be true, but that doesn't mean anything. Anyhow, let's get through this bit on the Kalam, and we'll just call it quits for the day because my brain is already hurting from all of this concentrated stupidity.
Or even, check this out, this is a form of the teleological argument appealing to the fine-tuning of the universe. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not due to physical necessity or chance, therefore it is due to design.
And you have to love premise 2, where it just arbitrarily disposes of the options he doesn't want to believe in with no evidence whatsoever. It just says, well, it's not those things, therefore whatever it is they're trying to get to. That still doesn't mean God designed everything, because you still haven't proven that God is real. That's why these arguments are just so stupid. They're all obviously self-serving. It's like saying the creator of the universe was either God, the flying spaghetti monster, or invisible intangible universe creating pixies. Well, it's not God or the FSM, therefore pixies did it. Now what does that actually prove? Not a damn thing.
In both arguments, here's what I want you to see. In both arguments, a causal agent, namely God, is inferred as being the explanation for the universe, as well as its features.
Says who? When did you ever demonstrate that? Just saying, but I really like this idea, that doesn't really mean anything. This is where we're going to stop for this video because this is getting pretty long and I'm already getting a headache. But really, how stupid do you have to be to really fall for any of this? How deluded are you if you can't see what your religion is doing wrong? This is just believing because you wanna. But that's stupid. This is all just, but God is this. Great. How the hell do you know that? You get deer in the headlights because they don't know. They've never rationally thought about it. It's an article of faith, and they're not used to using their brains for anything of any consequence. These are the questions that they can't answer, so they hide, or they scream and cry, and they kick and throw childish temper tantrums because it makes them feel bad to be questioned at all on these very basic articles of faith. Because they don't care if any of it is actually true. It's all fifis and nothing intelligent. I think most of them know that they should care. They know that people are looking at them and saying, well, why are those people so stupid over there? I think they're figuring that out. That's why we see lots of videos like this one where they impotently try to defend their absurd beliefs in the only way that they know how. We're special and we don't have to do what you want. We're the exception to the rule. Except you're not. You need to come up to the standards that exist. You don't get to make up your own. You can't just scream and cry until everybody gets tired of listening to you and gives in. Because we've done that for a lot of years now, and we're done. We just are. You can keep making fools of yourselves if you want, But you're not doing yourselves any favors. You're just convincing more and more people every day that you're as dumb as we've all been saying for years. And that's really not a great optic these days, is it? Maybe you ought to try to do better.